In the summer of 1947, something came down outside Roswell, New Mexico. Almost 80 years later, we're still arguing about what it was. But in 1994, a shoebox full of magnetic recording wire surfaced in a storage unit in Amarillo, Texas, left behind by a woman named Corinne Ashby, dead 6 months by then, a former Army nurse who spent the last 2 years of her life recording something onto spools of wire she never gave to anyone. Her granddaughter found the box. It took her 11 years to find someone who could play it. Before moving forward, please subscribe to the channel Now Let Back. What's on that recording isn't a confession exactly. It's closer to an inventory. A woman going through her own memory item by item, out loud, alone, as though she were trying to get it all down before something in her stopped working. And near the end of the third spool, in a voice that doesn't shake, Corinne Ashby says, "I held its hand while it died, and I need someone, someday, to know what it told me before it went. I want to tell you what's on those spools. Not what I think it means. What's actually there." Let me start where Corinne starts. On the tape, in her own words, more or less. It's July 1947, and she's 26 years old, a surgical nurse assigned to the base infirmary at Roswell Army Airfield. She's been there 14 months. By her own account, she is not the kind of woman prone to imagination. She says this herself on the recording, almost defensively, as though she can already hear what people will think of her. "I was not a fanciful girl. I want that understood before anything else." On the night in question, she says she was pulled from the nurses' quarters just after 1 a.m. by an officer she didn't recognize, who told her only that she was needed at a hangar on the far side of the base, one she'd never had reason to enter. No explanation, no paperwork. She remembers being told to leave her name tag behind. This is where her account stops resembling a normal night shift and starts resembling something else. She describes the hangar as partitioned with canvas sheeting reinforced along the seams with something rigid, wood or metal battens. She couldn't tell which in the dark. There were 3 examination stations set up under portable surgical lighting, the kind normally reserved for field hospitals. She remembers the smell most vividly of anything from that night. Not blood, not antiseptic, something she compares to the inside of a spent shell casing, a scorched metal smell that stayed in her uniform for 2 days no matter how many times it was washed. At the first 2 stations, she says, were bodies she initially took for badly burned airmen. Small, too small. She attributes this at first to shock, to the hour, to poor light. She keeps walking. At the 3rd station is where her account becomes, in her words, "a thing I have spent 47 years trying to explain to myself and cannot." She describes a being approximately 4 feet in height, its skin a flat greyish tone she compares. And this detail she repeats twice on the recording, word for word both times, to "the colour of a rain cloud before it decides what it's going to do." Its head was disproportionately large, its eyes were open, dark, without visible pupil or iris, and she says the sensation of being looked at by those eyes was unlike anything in her nursing experience. Not threatening. Total. As though it were reading her the way you'd read a chart. She counts 3 fingers on each hand. Not 4, not 5. She's specific about this, and specific about correcting herself once on the tape, as if she'd misremembered it for years and only now, alone with the recorder, worked out that she'd had it wrong. The skin of its hands, she says, carried a faint patterning, almost like a watermark, visible only when the surgical light hit it at a certain angle. She never saw it move under its own power. It was breathing, she says, in long, irregular intervals, and it was, by any measure she understood, dying. She goes to it because that's what a nurse does. She says this plainly, without sentiment, on the tape. "I did not go to it because I believed it was owed comfort as a matter of philosophy. I went because it was in front of me and it was dying, and that is the job." She takes its hand, and here, twice through the recording, in 2 separate spools recorded months apart, she describes what happened next in almost identical language, which is, on its own, an odd kind of evidence. People embellishing a memory tend to drift with each retelling. Before we go further, please subscribe to the channel and comment from you are watching. Corinne Ashby's account barely moves at all across 2 sittings separated by roughly a year. She says the fingers closed around hers with what she calls deliberate weight. Not a reflex, not a spasm, something closer to intention. And then, she says, she began to receive what she can only describe as pressure behind her sternum, a sensation of something being placed there rather than communicated to her ear or her mind. Not words. Not quite images either. She uses the word weather. She says it felt like weather arriving inside her chest, a front moving through, cold and enormous and utterly specific to somewhere she had never been and had no reference for. She stayed, by her estimate, close to 50 minutes. Her watch, she notes, had stopped at some point during the encounter and never restarted correctly for the rest of its working life. A detail her granddaughter later confirmed, because the watch itself survived, sitting in a drawer for decades, permanently off by exactly 51 minutes. At some point, the grip loosened. The eyes, she says, stayed open. She didn't know, and still didn't know 47 years later, whether it had died in her hands or simply stopped being present in some way she had no vocabulary for. Then an officer was at her shoulder, and she was walked out, and she was never, in her words, told a single official thing about what I had just done for the rest of my career. Now, here's where I have to put my skeptic hat back on, because a recorded memory made decades after the fact, by a woman who is no longer alive to be questioned, is not the same thing as evidence. Memory reshapes itself. Grief and time, and the human need for meaning all leave fingerprints on a story like this. I don't take this kind of account and run with it uncritically, but there's a texture to what's on those spools that resists the easy explanation of pure invention. She doesn't dress it up. She corrects herself. She admits when she's not sure. At one point on the second spool, she stops mid-sentence and says, "I don't know if that's what happened or if that's what I've decided happened. I've had a long time to decide things." That kind of self-interruption is not what fabricated testimony usually sounds like. Fabrication tends to be clean. This isn't clean. This is a woman audibly working against her own memory in real time. And she is not, on paper, an easy woman to dismiss. Corinne Ashby's service record, the portion of it that has surfaced through her family and through a handful of declassified personnel documents released in stages between 1978 and 2005, confirms she was a licensed surgical nurse, confirms her assignment to Roswell Army Airfield beginning in the spring of 1946, and confirms, oddly, a gap. Her official personnel file shows a reassignment to administrative and inventory duties, Fort Bliss, Texas, dated August 4, 1947, 11 days after the date she gives on the recording for the encounter. A trained surgical nurse moved off clinical duty entirely and shuffled into a records office 300 miles away, within less than 2 weeks. Her family has no explanation for this reassignment beyond what Corinne herself says on the tapes. I asked why. Nobody answered me. Eventually I stopped asking, because I understood the asking itself was the thing they didn't like. I want to pause on something, because the deeper you dig into stories like this one, the more a pattern starts to surface, and once you see it, you can't quite stop seeing it. Corinne Ashby is not the only nurse from Roswell Army Airfield whose service record shows a sudden, unexplained shift away from clinical duty in the back half of 1947. Researchers combing through the same declassified personnel batches have identified at least 6 other cases. Women, all medical staff, all reassigned to administrative postings within weeks of that summer, none with any documented reason on file. Not all 6 left behind an account. Most left behind nothing at all. Just the gap in the paperwork, sitting there, unexplained, waiting for someone to notice it. Corinne, as far as anyone has been able to determine, is the only one who ever spoke, and even she waited 47 years, and even then, only to a spool of wire in an empty apartment, with no one else in the room. Why nurses? I've turned this question over more times than I can count, and the most persuasive answer I've come across is also the simplest one. Doctors treat and move on. Nurses stay. If you needed a witness to a death, any death, human or otherwise, a nurse is the person who would be in the room long enough to actually see it happen, and long enough to remember exactly how. The tapes don't end with the death in the hangar. Corinne kept going. And this, I think, is the part of her account that deserves the most attention, because it's the part almost nobody talks about when they tell stories like this. Not the encounter itself, but what it did to the rest of a person's life. On the second spool, recorded roughly a year after the first, she describes what she calls the after. a period she says lasted the better part of 2 years, during which she experienced what she terms pressure returns. Moments, unpredictable and brief, where the same sensation from the hanger would resurface in her chest, unprompted, usually late at night, usually accompanied by what she describes as a specific and consistent image. A horizon line, flat and colorless, under a sky she says had too many directions in it. She never explains what that means. She says she isn't sure she's supposed to. She married in 1951, a machinist named Walter Ashby, and by her account never told him the full story. Only, she says, enough that he stopped asking questions, which was its own kind of mercy. She raised 2 children. She worked, eventually, as a records clerk for a private medical practice in Amarillo, a job her granddaughter describes as strange only in retrospect. A former surgical nurse, spending the last 3 decades of her working life filing paper instead of treating patients, by her own choice, according to family, because she said hospitals asked too many questions she didn't want asked of her. And then, in 1993, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and something in her changed. Her granddaughter, a woman named Renee Cobb, who was in her early 20s at the time, and who I spoke with at length while researching this, says her grandmother became, in her words, lighter somehow, once she knew she was dying. Like she'd been carrying something for so long, that finding out she had an end date was almost a relief, because it meant the carrying had a limit now. Corinne bought the wire recorder from a pawn shop in late 1993. She told no one what she was using it for. She recorded, by Renee's estimate, on and off over roughly 14 months. Always alone, always at night, and never once played any of it back for anyone while she was alive. She died in March of 1994. The recorder and the spools sat in a storage unit her family didn't get around to clearing out until nearly a decade later, when Renee, going through the last of it, found the shoebox and a note taped to the lid that said only, "For whoever finally wants to know." It took Renee until 2005 to find a technician who could still service a wire recorder and pull clean audio off spools that old. What came off those 3 spools runs just under 2 hours total, and the last 15 minutes are, by Renee's own account, the hardest to listen to. Before moving on that final stretch, please subscribe to the channel. Corinne's voice is noticeably weaker, and she says something I want to read to you as close to verbatim as I can, because I think it's the center of the entire account. She says, "It told me something before it went. Not words. I want to be honest that it was never words. But there was one thing that came through clear enough that I've never been able to lose it. Not in 47 years. Not once. It wasn't about them. It wasn't about where they came from, or why they were here, or what they wanted. It was about grief. Not mine. Not for the dying, not even for itself. It was grieving something about us. I don't know what. I've spent my whole life since that night trying to work out what it was we'd done, or hadn't done, or were going to do, that would make a dying thing from somewhere else spend its very last feeling on being sorry for us." That's it. That's the closest thing to a final message anywhere on the recording. Not a warning, not a location, not a revelation about the universe. Grief, aimed outward, at us, from something that had every reason, in its final minutes, to think only of itself. I keep coming back to that, because it's the detail that resists every easy explanation I can construct. If Corinne Ashby invented this story, for attention, for meaning, for some private psychological need I can't diagnose from here, the invention doesn't behave the way inventions usually behave. Invented stories tend to hand the audience something satisfying. A warning, a secret, a piece of forbidden knowledge. This gives you almost nothing except an unexplained sorrow, and 47 years of a woman quietly not knowing what to do with it. There's more on the tape I haven't mentioned. Smaller things, harder to build a narrative around, but worth noting because they're the kind of granular detail that fabricated accounts tend to skip. She mentions that her hands smell faintly of that scorched metal odor for 2 full days afterward, no matter how many times she washed. She mentions a sergeant she names only as Pruitt, an orderly who she believed had also been present that night at one of the other 2 stations, and who she says was transferred out of Roswell entirely within the month, and who she never saw or heard from again, despite writing to him twice at an address that was returned both times as undeliverable. Researchers combing enlistment records have found a Walter Pruitt who served briefly at Roswell Army Airfield in the summer of 1947 and whose file shows a transfer, dated the same week as Corinne's, to a facility whose designation has never been matched to any publicly known installation. I want to be careful here, the way I try to be careful with every account like this one. I'm not telling you Corinne Ashby held the hand of a dying extraterrestrial being in a hangar in New Mexico in the summer of 1947. I don't know that. Nobody living can verify it. What I can tell you is that a woman with an unremarkable, well-documented service record left behind a set of private recordings, made alone, at the end of her life, with nothing to gain from the telling, describing an experience she said she'd carried in total silence for nearly 5 decades, and that her own official file shows an unexplained reassignment 11 days after the date she names, and that at least 6 other nurses from the same base show the same kind of unexplained gap in the same narrow window of time, and that one of the only other names she gives, an orderly named Pruitt, appears to check out as far as the records allow. None of that proves the hangar. None of that proves the hand, or the grief, or the sky with too many directions in it. But it's not nothing either. It's the shape of something. And the shape doesn't look like a lie so much as it looks like the outline of a woman who spent her whole adult life managing a secret she never wanted and never fully understood, and who only let it go once she had nothing left to protect. So I'll leave you with the questions I can't stop asking myself. What was it Corinne Ashby actually felt, alone in that hangar, holding the hand of something that had no business existing anywhere near a New Mexico military base? What does it mean that the last thing a dying, non-human intelligence apparently chose to communicate wasn't a warning, or a secret, or a location, but sorrow, pointed directly at us? Why grief specifically, and why then, and why her? What happened to Walter Pruitt, and to the 6 other nurses whose files go quiet in that same 11-day window in August of 1947? Were they told to disappear from clinical duty? Or did they ask to be moved, the way Corinne herself seems to suggest she might have half wanted, if only to put distance between herself and whatever she now knew? And what was it, exactly, that a creature from somewhere else in the universe looked at, in the last minutes of its life, on this planet, in that hangar, in the hands of a 26-year-old nurse from Amarillo, and decided was worth mourning? We don't know. We have 2 hours of wire recording, a stopped watch permanently off by 51 minutes, a personnel file with an 11-day gap nobody has ever explained, and a note taped to the inside of a shoebox lid that says only, "For whoever finally wants to know." Somebody wanted to know. Now you do too. And I don't think any of us are any closer to being able to answer her. If you find video interesting, please subscribe to the channel.